Our first speaker is Peter Hudis, who's a distinguished professor of philosophy and humanities at Oakton College in the United States. He's the author of Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism and of Frantz Fanon, philosopher of the barricades. We're very honored to have him because he's also the general editor of the complete works of Rosy Luxemburg, which is a 17-volume collection, I think still ongoing now, at Verso Books. And he published, he did a lot of publications on Rosy Luxemburg, such as the Rosy Luxemburg Reader or the Letters of Rosy Luxemburg, where he acted as editor. So again, he's probably one of the most distinguished, like one of the highly distinguished person here to actually talk about Rosy Luxemburg. Then I will introduce our two panelists, whom you don't see because they sit in the audience. So the lady here is Ankica Čakardić, who teaches at the Department of Philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. And she published books such as Dionysian Socialism of Praxis School, Yugoslav Marxist Philosophy and Feminist Rewriting, which is actually, no, sorry, that one is upcoming in 2026. But her past books include The Rebellious Mind, Essays in Radical Social Philosophy in 2021, or Like a Clap of Thunder, 3 essays on Rosy Luxemburg from 2019, and The Spectres of Transition, Social History of Capitalism from 2019. And finally, I will introduce Claudia Horn, whom you see here as a third panelist, and who's a lecturer in political economy at King's College London. And she actually has 2 still upcoming books, I guess, which are Where Money Grows on Trees, European Carbon Politics in Brazilian Amazon, and Rosy Luxemburg's Herbarium, Radical Ecology and the Global Plantation. You actually studied the Rosy Luxemburg's Herbarium, which I saw you so nicely presenting at HM London. So welcome to our speakers, and we let Peter start. Thank you, Peter, and sorry for excuse us for not flying you over to Prague, but we're so happy to at least see you and hear you. So welcome.
Well, my apologies for not being there in person. Thank you very much. It's great to participate in this discussion, but things being as they are, I have to address you from the belly of the beast, the United States. So my topic is rethinking Rosy Luxemburg's legacy in dark times. And I'll begin with this. When Rosy Luxemburg proclaimed during the midst of World War I that the choice facing humanity was socialism or barbarism, she could not have known of the depth of barbarism that would soon engulf much of the world following her death, with the rise of fascism, Stalinism, and the perpetration of any number of genocides against colonized peoples in the non-Western world. But we who have experienced over the past several years, especially the pain and horror unleashed by rampant racism, sexism, transphobia, political repression, war, and genocide, can identify with her sentiment all too well. My comments will focus on just 2 aspects of Luxemburg's legacy that I think may speak to us in these dark times. One, her insistence that a democratic republic is the form best suited for advancing the cause of socialism. And second, her conception of how to achieve the transition from a bourgeois democratic republic to the creation of a socialist society. 2 questions that are obviously complementary to each other. Certainly, no one can doubt that today, political democracy is under attack worldwide. It's evident in the growing power of the far right in Europe and much of Latin America, and the consolidation of authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, Israel, India, Turkey, and elsewhere. The foremost expression of this, of course, is the Trump administration in the US, which is waging a relentless war against immigrants, women, trans rights, the LGBTQ plus movement, Blacks, Latinos, and other minorities, while providing free rein for capital to wage a relentless war in the working class. Trump has dismantled dozens of government agencies, as many of you know, fired hundreds of thousands of civil servants, drastically cut funding for science, health, and education, targeted universities and law firms that do not bow to his will, and gutted policies to combat global warming and environmental destruction. Thousands inside and outside academia have lost their jobs in the past year alone for criticizing aspects of U.S. foreign or domestic policy, impacting far more people, actually, than McCarthy's witch hunts of the 1950s. This assault on what remains of liberal democracy is driven by an effort, I think, on the part of global elites to siphon off as much personal wealth as they can in the face of capitalism's intractable social and environmental crises. I think that Aimé Césaire captured the spirit of the time in his discourse on colonialism when he wrote back in 1950, and I quote him directly here, "The hour of the barbarian is at hand, the modern barbarian, the American hour. Violence, excess, waste, mercantilism, bluff, conformism, stupidity, vulgarity, disorder," end quote. So, given this, what insights can Luxemburg's legacy provide for the effort to defend and extend liberal democracy, at the same time as not compromising in any way, shape, or form on the need for a revolutionary uprooting of capitalism? That's a very difficult path to navigate, which in many respects was the issue in many of Luxemburg's polemics with leading figures in the socialist movement of her time. Yes, she certainly opposed reformist and opportunist elements in the German social democratic movement, as of course most famously displayed in the criticism of Bernstein's reformism, which has already been discussed here today. And of course, starting in 1910, her critique of Kautsky's opportunistic move to the right. She sharply attacked socialists who accepted executive positions in bourgeois governments, as in the Millerand affair in France, and repeatedly took issues with tendencies that prioritized parliamentarism and trade unionism over revolutionary politics. But in doing so, she did not desert the battle for democracy. She tirelessly campaigned for SPD electoral candidates, fought restrictions against freedom of the press, supported legislation that improved workers' lives, and promoted efforts to push Germany towards a democratic republic. In doing so, she was hardly unique. It was a basic staple of socialist politics from Marx's time onward, at least in her era, that the class struggle is most successfully waged in conditions of political democracy. As Marx himself stated in the Critique of the Gotha program, and I quote Marx, "The democratic republic is precisely the last state form of bourgeois society that the class struggle has to be fought out to a conclusion," end quote. What proved far more controversial, of course, was how to maintain this position while preparing the proletariat for the inevitably violent effort to destroy class domination and create a socialist society. Luxemburg never held that a parliamentary republic would necessarily lead to socialism. She emphasized, for instance, in her polemic with Bernstein, that socialism does not naturally evolve from constitutional democracy. And she furthermore held, quoting her, that no absolute and universal relation can be constructed between capitalist development and democracy. As she put it in Social Reform or Revolution, the fate of the socialist movement is not bound to bourgeois democracy, but the fate of democracy, on the contrary, is bound to the socialist movement, end quote. Luxemburg's critique of revisionism and support of the mass strike was at first supported by many SPD leaders, though not always for the right reasons. Some recoiled from Bernstein because they were not because they were principled revolutionaries, but because they saw the logical conclusion of his position as rendering superfluous the need for their cherished party. However, things began to change after 1906. As the SPD's electoral power grew, some of her closest allies began to recoil from her insistence that the party prioritize the mass strike over parliamentarism, which the publication at this event is celebrating very much documents. The pivotal break came in 1910, when an article advocating the mass strike in Vorwärts was rejected on the grounds that the party leadership wanted to defer discussing the mass strike until after parliamentary elections. She then submitted the piece to Kautsky's Neue Zeit, who promised to publish it so long as she cut a paragraph calling for the abolition of the monarchy. With elections approaching, he did not want to risk the party's fortunes on such radical demands. Luxemburg was furious and broke off all relations with her. That's in 1910. The polemic intensified when shortly afterwards, Kautsky refrained from openly opposing Germany's effort to occupy Morocco. She now recognized by then that Kautsky represented a new form of opportunism 4 years before Lenin, Trotsky, or Martov had his number. Dunevskaya noted in her study of Rosa Luxemburg, stated the following, and I quote, "To this day, even those revolutionaries who, armed with hindsight, do see that the dispute between Luxemburg and Kautsky first exposed the abysmal opportunism at the top, which ultimately led to nothing short of the party's betrayal in 1914, still act as if Luxemburg's Prussian stand was accidental, or even just a personal pique on her part. But it was nothing of the sort. Luxemburg held that when a party becomes committed to electoral politics and parliamentarism, it inevitably comes to believe, as Luxemburg put it, that the goals of a socialist society can and indeed must be promoted through constitutional means," the position she was critiquing. But socialism, of course, she said, cannot be created by such means, since the state is an expression of the relations of civil society, central to which is the property right of capitalists and their control over the means of production. Political legislation can ameliorate the inequities of civil society, but cannot eliminate them. Only a radical uprooting from below can do so. As she put it, quote, "In effect, every legal constitution is the product of a revolution. In the history of classes, revolution is the act of creation, while legislation is the political expression of the life of a society that has already come into being," end quote. And this is actually exactly what the young Marx upheld when he stated in 1842, quoting Marx, "For a new constitution, a real revolution has always been required," end quote. This remains a very tricky relation for us to navigate today, when prospects for revolution seem so distant, even as efforts to develop a socialist alternative is gaining new life in certain arenas. For instance, for the first time in the history of the United States, an avowed socialist, Saran Mandani, is the mayor of its largest city. It's an enormous accomplishment, made possible by no less than 80,000 young volunteers going door to door on behalf of his candidacy. Nevertheless, he clearly faces a series of institutional obstacles that will make it difficult for him and his followers to implement a progressive agenda. But what is often overlooked by left-wing critics of this kind of electoral path to power is that such constraints are by no means annulled or overcome when power is seized through revolutionary insurrection. As Lenin commented near the end of his life in referring to his own Bolshevik regime, and I quote here Lenin, quote, "We took over the state apparatus from Tsarism and slightly anointed it with Soviet oil," end quote. Lenin's call in State and Revolution back in 1917 to smash the old state bureaucracy had been dropped by 1919. The problem of how to move from the capture of state power to overturning the social relations that constitute the logic of capital is extremely challenging. It remains the most unresolved issue in the history of Marxism, unresolved on the part of reformists as well as revolutionaries. Now, Luxemburg was clear that the problem could not be resolved by treating democracy as a cumbersome mechanism, to use Trotsky's phrase, that can be put aside in furthering revolutionary transformation. As is well known, as Mikhail just finished telling us, she was sharply critical of the Bolsheviks for suppressing democracy after the October Revolution, even though she supported the insurrection that brought the Bolsheviks to power. And although her critique is most famously expressed in the 1918 booklet on the Russian Revolution, I believe the critique is anticipated in some respects by her remarkable but much less known essay that she wrote in 1908 called Lessons of the Three Dumas. We recently only made this available for the first time in English about 2 years ago in volume 4 of the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, about 3 years ago. In this essay from 1908, Luxemburg raises the question of what might occur if a working class party comes to power in a technologically underdeveloped country. Of course, Russia at the time was exactly that. Comes to power in technologically underdeveloped society in which the objective and subjective conditions for achieving a transition to socialism, at least in the short term, are lacking. It's a question that's been faced by virtually every revolution in the global South since Luxemburg wrote these lines. Now, it was clear to virtually everyone at the time that it was impossible to create socialism in one country, let alone in an overwhelmingly peasant and technologically underdeveloped society such as was the Russian Empire. There was also no question of confining the struggle within parliamentary channels, since Russia was an absolutist state. Insurrection was therefore embraced by virtually every left-wing party. But that did not mean they ignored the need for a democratic republic. Luxemburg, like other Marxists of the time, held that Russia's material conditions mandated that the task was to replace Tsarism with liberal democracy. However, she held that since the Russian bourgeoisie was weak and indecisive, the task of creating such a democratic republic fell to the proletariat. Her position that the political form of the revolution is proletarian, while its economic content is bourgeois, led her to take issue with the Mensheviks and ally herself instead in 1906 and 1907, especially with Lenin's Bolsheviks. By 1908, however, the revolution had been defeated. She therefore asks in the Three Dumas, what would happen if the working class managed to successfully take power prior to revolutions occurring in the technologically developed West? And she wrote the following, and I quote, "The socialist revolution," she says, "can only be a result of an international revolution, and decisive is the level and form of development of class relations and proletarian operations in other capitalist countries," end quote. But, now back to me speaking, if the transition to socialism cannot occur without revolutions in the West, how likely is it that the working class will be able to maintain its rule in the single country if it actually does come to power in the course of a revolution? Now, Luxemburg is brutally honest on this score in 1908. She writes the following, quote, "The working class cannot delude itself that, having overthrown absolutism and attained a dictatorship for a certain period, that it will establish a socialist system," end quote. She refers to the inevitable removal, that's her words, the inevitable removal of the proletariat from power by a counter-revolutionary operation of the bourgeoisie, if the revolution is limited to a single country. And she concludes, it may be that in the end, after the proletariat is overthrown, the republic will disappear. But this will not mean that the revolution will have been in vain, she argues, since, as she puts it, if the revolutionary proletariat in Russia, again, her words, were to gain political power, however temporarily, that would provide enormous encouragement to the international class struggle, thereby inspiring future revolutions to come. Now, Luxemburg's essay, The Three Dumas, speaks to what happened, I believe, a decade later, when Tsarism was overthrown in 1917, followed by the Bolshevik seizure of power. Lenin was fully aware that Russia's material conditions did not permit the immediate creation of socialism. This is why he worked to foster proletarian revolutions in Western Europe. However, his regime did not take the form of a democratic republic, as seen in his suppression of political liberties. Moreover, Lenin famously declared in 1918 that now that we have seized power, we intend to keep it permanently. Permanently. I don't think he wavered from that for a second from within a week or two of seizing power. This is the total opposite of Luxemburg's insistence that the inability of the proletariat to stay in power, as she put it, is not the worst outcome, so long as a democratic republic based on the rule of the working class can serve as the example that inspires future revolutions, as the Paris Commune of 1871 inspired future revolutions, even though it was, of course, defeated because it was isolated to one single city. Now, when you think about it, this is a rather startling conclusion, namely her claim that it's better for the revolution to go under than for it to be discredited by a so-called revolutionary party that tries to hang on to power through undemocratic means. Now, one could argue different sides of this. One could argue that Luxemburg failed to foresee what we, by hindsight, know all too well, which she couldn't have known at the time, namely, that an aborted revolution or failed revolution is often replaced not by a return to constitutional monarchy, as she kind of expected might happen if a subsequent revolution in Russia failed, but it could lead the failure of a revolution to outright reaction that takes the form of fascism. What we also know all too well is that by suppressing democracy, the Russian Revolution devolved into something just as sinister as fascism, namely Stalinism. And what we also know is that many revolutions occurred in the global South in the decades following Luxemburg's death that, with a few exceptions, took the form of undemocratic single-party dictatorships. The Marxist-Leninist, or what claimed itself to be the Marxist-Leninist approach, became codified as the path forward for the anti-colonial world. Though progress was surely made in overthrowing the shackles of imperialism by these anti-colonial revolutions, a transition to socialism was, in the final analysis, not achieved or reached by any of them, despite the claims of having done so by nationalizing property under a state plan. What actually resulted was state capitalist dictatorships, which over time, with one or two exceptions, mutated into various iterations of market capitalism. Frantz Fanon's warning, quoting him, that puts it in The Wretched of the Earth, that the single party is the modern form of the bourgeois dictatorship, stripped of mask, makeup, and scruples, cynical in every respect. And that, as he put it, sooner or later, the single party skips the parliamentary phase and chooses a national socialist-type dictatorship, went unheeded. We are living, I believe, in the bitter shadow of these defeats, which so discredited the very idea of socialism as to provide an opening for the far right today to step in and claim they are best suited to rule a world in which there is presumably no alternative to capitalism. But they will not have the last word, since as Rosa understood, the quest for freedom from capitalism, racism, and sexism will survive even the most monstrous of defeats. The very fact that we are still celebrating her legacy today at this meeting, a century after her murder, is a testimony to that very fact. Thank you.
Peter, I hope you heard a loud applause. Because I'm not sure if it's going to the mic, but there was a loud applause. So now I'll pass it to Ankita and Claudia.
Shall I go first? Okay, just a few seconds. Okay, here we are. Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you, Jana, for the earlier introduction and for having me here. It is a pleasure, and congratulations on this important translation. Many thanks to my fellow panelists. So the talk that I'm going to present is basically covering the title, Nobody Left Behind, Rosa Luxemburg on Gender, Labor and Colonial Violence. So Rosa Luxemburg refused to leave anybody behind. Not a single victim of capital's violence, not colonized peoples, not women. We are living through an extraordinary moment in Luxembourg scholarship. In recent years, thousands of pages written in Polish, texts never previously translated into German, have been discovered in the archives, transforming our understanding of her life and thought in the ways that are still unfolding. So in the next 20 minutes, a small piece of breaking news. I will walk you through some of these until recently unknown early writings by Rosa Luxemburg. Many of these texts will soon appear in the English for the first time in Volume 6 of the Complete Works of Rosa Luxemburg, which I have the privilege of co-editing, and with Peter Hudis as general editor of the Complete Works, which is forthcoming with Verso Books. What strikes me the most is how powerfully these texts resonate with our present moment, particularly on questions of gender, labor, and colonial violence. Whether that continuity is reassuring or troubling, I will leave you to decide. So Luxemburg's, as we heard already, political story begins in Warsaw, where she joined the revolutionary movement while still in high school. But as repression intensified, she was forced into exile, leaving Warsaw for Zurich by the end of 1889. There she found herself among Polish and Russian revolutionaries who would eventually shape the course of European and world socialism. Already in 1893, she co-founded Polish socialist newspaper Sprawa Robotnicza with Leo Jogices, Julian Marchlewski, and other students in exile. A year later, she took over as editor, writing under the pseudonym Kruszczyńska. Luxemburg devoted her early writings in Sprawa Robotnicza to analyzing the concrete conditions of Polish workers. Between 1893 and 1894, she published 5 articles examining worker protection legislation, and this series reveals both her sustained engagement with labor reform and her critical analysis of how protective legislation operated within the structural constraints of the capitalist system. Significantly, in addressing questions of labor protection, she also engaged deeply with feminist concerns. These pages on women's working conditions can thus be situated within Luxemburg's broader feminist writings, and I should note that across her entire opus, I have located so far only 5 explicitly feminist texts, which nonetheless demonstrate that questions on women's emancipation were actually woven throughout her analysis of capitalism, labor struggles, and revolutionary politics. These published theoretical interventions, however, represent only part of Luxemburg's engagement with women's emancipation. She strongly championed the organizational efforts of the socialist women's movement, but expressed her support primarily through her collaboration with her close friend Clara Zetkin. What unites both her published writings on feminist issues and her organizational support for women's emancipation is a consistent analytical framework. Throughout her feminist work, Luxemburg analyzes the position of proletarian women within the context of capitalist exploitation and oppression, while simultaneously criticizing bourgeois feminism for its elitism and lack of class inclusivity. She applies the same approach in her essay titled Ladies and Women, published in the Polish newspaper Gazeta Ludowa on 16 June 1904, where she writes the following with her typical irony. The bourgeoisie loudly proclaims the principle of political equality between women and men and gallantly bows to these vocal ladies, full aware that this entire women's movement is merely a plaything. With stern seriousness and disdainful smile, the conscious working class woman knows that as long as the bourgeoisie rules, women's political equality with men remains a dream. End of quote. The critique of bourgeois feminism rested on the deeper analytical foundation. For Luxemburg, capitalism does not merely exploit workers at the point of production. It structures social reproduction itself as a totality, transforming human life into a commodity at every level. We might read her development of this analysis as addressing the problem of the value form, especially when she notes that, quote, "The worker is but a part of capital, a part of the money he invested in his interest, a commodity he bought, labor power," end of quote. While Luxemburg obviously herself does not employ the terminology of fetishism of commodities or reification in the Lukácsian sense, her analysis here offers a rare instance of what we might understand today as the core logic of the value form. Labor power becomes commodified, valued not according to human need, but by the abstract measure of socially necessary labor time required for the worker's reproduction, thereby reducing life itself to an object of capital's valorization process. From here, Luxemburg turns to a second Marxist feminist problem she addresses in the same essay, the feminization of labor. As women enter any given sector of the labor market, wages in that field systematically decline. Luxemburg writes, "The reserve army of workers is steadily growing. The reason is that increasingly machines are coming into use that make it possible for women and children to replace the worker and thus become competition to him. Because the capitalist always has the option to hire others or to introduce machines, he can push his exploitation to the highest possible level." This dynamic, which Luxemburg identified over 130 years ago, operates with devastating precision today. Consider professions coded as women's work, social reproductive labor, nursing, social work, childcare, teaching. Despite being essentially socially essential, they remain systematically undervalued and underpaid. The feminization of labor is further complicated by a third interconnected feminist issue that Luxemburg examines in yet another Polish essay, the intersection of class exploitation and gender oppression. If capital exploits gender divisions of labor to cheapen labor power, it does so not in a vacuum, but within existing capitalist structures that render women vulnerable to both exploitation and workplace violence. Luxemburg again writes, "The capitalist has only one thought and one objective. He wants to extract as much strenuous labor from the worker as possible, whilst paying him as little as possible. So let's put women and children in the factories too. Moreover," she continues, "capitalist has the added convenience of women and children being far more vulnerable and submissive to his will, so that the exploitation takes place far more easily and more brazenly without any of the resistance usually offered by abused male workers." End of quote. When we witness today women garment workers in Bangladesh laboring under nominally protective legislations, yet facing deadly factory collapses like Rana Plaza, when migrant care workers in Europe and North America and domestic workers across the Gulf remain entirely excluded from labor law protections, working in the conditions of near slavery, we see Luxemburg's analysis confirmed across contemporary global capitalism. And such interlocking problems, the commodification of labor power, the decline of wages through feminization of labor, the unitary process of capitalist exploitation and gender oppression, culminate in what Luxemburg describes as the fundamental violence inherent in capitalist relations themselves. To illustrate this, she writes the following: "For every few hundred dead workers, the life of one capitalist is traded. For the capitalist to grow fat, strong and burly, the worker becomes thin, weak and miserable. The capitalist fattens himself on the lifeblood he sucks from the worker." End of quote. The fundamental violence Luxemburg identified in capitalist relations, capital fattening itself on the lifeblood of workers, and gender oppression, manifested with even more brutal intensity in the colonial periphery, where entire peoples faced not merely exploitation, but genocide. Throughout her writings in the Polish newspaper Gazeta Ludowa between January and June 1904, Luxemburg sought to inform Polish proletarians about the horrific violence unfolding in the Germany's African colonies, a topic she would develop later more fully in her magnum opus, The Accumulation of Capital, and the Unionist pamphlet. Embodying what we might call Marxist epistemic care, she wanted Polish workers to understand that what's happening in Southwest Africa and to extend their solidarity to African victims of German colonial oppression. Almost every issue of Gazeta Ludowa from this period features her reports on colonial resistance in Africa, especially the Nama and Herero peoples' struggle against the German genocide. In doing so, Luxemburg exposed the colonial genocide in Namibia to a readership that desperately needed to confront this reality, as Peter Hudis emphasized in some of his essays. In the February 1904 issue of Gazeta Ludowa, under the rubric Colonial Atrocities, Luxemburg wrote that the forced labor imposed on African people in Congo meant nothing other than actual slavery, as Europeans spread, as she wrote, civilization through capital with looting, murder and torture. Her analysis illuminates what we might call today racial capitalism, when we witness the hyper-exploitation of women workers in export processing zones across the global South today, sewing our clothes, assembling our electronics, growing our food, when indigenous women and defenders, land defenders in Canada, Brazil and the Philippines face violence and assassinations for resisting extractive industries, when Black and migrant women remain systematically excluded from labor protections in domestic work sectors worldwide, we see the same dynamics Luxemburg identified. Capital's parasitic relation to life itself, operating through intersecting structures of gender, race, and colonial domination. Luxemburg's vivid accounts of colonial violence in her Polish newspaper articles presented here were not merely humanitarian writing or reporting. They formed the empirical foundation for her theoretical analysis of imperialism. For instance, on 24th April 1904, she wrote, "We are witnessing the trampling of ancient customs, the extermination of entire peoples, all for the profit of a band of capitalist parasites from Germany, France, England, Russia, Belgium, Italy, and Netherlands. These leeches," she continues to report, "are not content with the feeding of the blood and sweat of exploited workers in their own countries. They push forward, followed by murderous soldiers across lands, and seas to seize entire new worlds to devour whole peoples." And this is called colonial policy, end of quote. Where capitalism today, Luxemburg continues to write, clears the way through deserts, mountains, and oceans, we shall one day stand as united humanity, sweeping away injustice and oppression from the river to the sea. Whilst Luxemburg obviously didn't write the final part of the sentence I just quoted, the parallels she enables us to draw are striking. The colonial genocide of the Herero and Nama people shares fundamental characteristics with ongoing forms of colonial violence today. When we witness Israeli settler colonial violence, genocide in Palestine, the systematic dispossession, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the denial of water and medical care, the destruction of entire communities, we see the same logic of elimination Luxemburg documented in Namibia. We witness capital's deadly indifference to racialized and colonized life. Luxemburg refuses any politics that would defer one liberation struggle for the sake of another, insisting instead on the material interconnections of all forms of capital exploitation and oppression. Her work challenges us to build movements capable of confronting capitalism as totality. And to circle back to the title of this presentation and to conclude. Nobody left behind. This is Luxemburg's insistence that the liberation of women workers, the freedom of colonized peoples, and the emancipation of the working class as a whole are not separate struggles to be pursued sequentially, but materially bound dimensions of a single, unitary, revolutionary project. Capitalism exploits and abandons bodies everywhere, and our response must be equally comprehensive. Social reform or revolution is precisely where this challenge is sharpest. The book's central argument that reform and revolution are not complementary parts, but antagonistic strategies, is not merely a debate about tactics. It is a question about what are we willing to leave behind. When we are told that reproductive rights must wait, or that colonial violence is a separate question from class struggle, we are hearing precisely the logic Luxemburg dismantled, and her answer remains ours. Read Rosy Luxemburg not as a lesson from history, but as a call to action for today. And what better occasion to do so than the publication of this new Czech translation of Reforma, nebo, revoluce, a book that remains as urgent as the day it was written.
Hello? Okay, yes, hello. It's strange, I don't hear myself. I'm so very sorry that I don't sound like myself. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Jana, for organizing it. It's also very nice to be here because it's just 2 hours from where I grew up in Dresden. And thank you, my fellow speakers. So I will just add to this. I mean, I'm very aware I'm also the last person speaking. And many of the arguments I'm saying connect very much also, of course, to what my previous speakers said about Rosy Luxemburg's great awareness of global colonialism, of global exploitation. That in many ways she was anticipating a lot of the crisis, and so I'm gonna make a contribution how she also contributes to eco-Marxist, eco-socialist discussions and our debate of the ecological crisis that we have here. that we have now, that we are facing with that she could not know of, but with wildlife populations having declined by average around 70% in the last 50 years, with global warming, if it reaches 2%, 20% of the land species population will be under risk of extinction. And so while some sort of doomsday rich people build their bunkers in New Zealand, there is also another idea of liberal environmentalism, of ecological modernization. We have it again, reformism, that sort of a green capitalism can still save the world with corporate responsibility, the commodification of so-called environmental services, so putting a price tag on nature, on conservation, but also other new technology or the new financial technologies like green debt, green bonds, or tech solutions like carbon capture and storage. What I want to argue is that there are many connections and many things that also in this respect, as you said, Rosy Luxemburg already anticipates and doesn't have answers, of course, also how Michael said, but also already had a thought process that can stimulate our discussions today, so that she does make an important contribution to ecological critiques of capitalism, and including and especially to what many criticize as green capitalism or green extractivism. And this sort of encompasses then also her political writings, her political economy writings, but also her letters, of course, where she wrote a lot about the environment, and her herbarium, which is, yes, what I've been working on, the fact that she was a botanist and a zoologist, which she also studied in Zurich, and she pressed and annotated almost 400 plant specimens, mostly while imprisoned. But so she makes contributions to eco-Marxism in the accumulation of capital, but also in the introduction to political economy, where she writes, and is completely concerned with capital's environment, broadly speaking, and is concerned with the crisis of the social reproduction of capitalist societies, through externalizing the problems through what David Harvey calls spatiotemporal fixes, like imperialism and colonialism. So with her study of colonialism, she makes a lot of these contributions. But also because she offers us a very non-instrumentalist way of seeing nature in her letters and through her study of zoology and botany. So this is just the introduction. I will just maybe go over some of these contributions and some of her arguments, because of course 20 minutes aren't enough to discuss all of that. But luckily, many of the things have already been said as well. So first of all, I think it's important to define also what we need by critical ecology or radical ecology, because of course the contribution that eco-Marxism makes is understanding nature not as purely an ecological phenomenon. No? So seeing it also in relationship to political economy, and seeing human and non-human relationships also deeply political shaped, and shaped by capital, of course. So for instance, taking the example of a forest, many indigenous communities, riverine communities, social movements that I've had the honor of working with, they see the forest, of course, of livelihood as a home and as their territory. But if we think about other definitions, for instance, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, defines forest as simply land spanning more than 0.5 hectares with trees higher than 5 meters and a canopy cover of more than 10%. So this is, of course, an entirely technical definition, but it's also a definition that's very much shaped by capital interests of forestry already, and very much also by national sovereignty claims over forests. So, of course, this is then critical ecology or Marxist ecology understands that nature is shaped by the commodity form, by capitalist economies. And so Rosa Luxemburg already anticipates a lot of these arguments, especially of course in the accumulation of capital, where she talks about, similar to Marx also, who was very much reading agronomists at his time and was already seeing the effects of industrial agriculture on the soil by the depletion of nutrients. She takes this idea of the crisis and the metabolism, what Marxists call the metabolic rift, of course, which is also this internal ecological crisis of capitalism. She takes this to the global level, especially, and argues that the crisis that capitalism runs into, the crisis of the depletion of soil, the crisis of running out of natural resources, but mostly also a crisis from the fall of profit, from the limits to capital accumulation, that those are sort of exported to the global south, to the colonies, and of course, and this, yes, and of course, as you already said, this exploitation of non-capitalist spheres, like colonies, also has a gender aspect. You cited already several of her writings, but also in Women's Suffrage and Class Struggle, for instance, she writes that as long as capitalism and the wage system rule, only that kind of work is considered productive, which produces surplus value, which creates capitalist profit. From this point of view, the music hall dancer whose legs sweep profit into her employer's pocket is a productive worker, whereas all the toil of the proletarian women and mothers in the four walls of their homes is considered unproductive. This sounds brutal and insane, but corresponds exactly to the brutality and insanity of our present capitalist economy. So this is, of course, a great feminist contribution, but it's also a contribution to seeing social reproductive labor in the broadest sense and seeing the real world of labor, including also the reproduction of nature. So, and although she didn't have a sense of climate change as we have today, she already, in her letters, for example, she already observed also the impacts that industrial agriculture had on the land. So, for instance, in one letter to Sonja Liebknecht, in one letter that is from 1917, that is in the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. She wrote that only yesterday I read why the warblers are disappearing from Germany. Increasingly systematic forestry, gardening, and agriculture are step by step destroying our natural nesting and breeding places. Hollow trees, fallow land, thickets of shrubs, withered leaves on the garden grounds. It pained me so when I read that, not because of the song they sing for people, but rather it was the picture of the silent, irresistible extinction of these defenseless little creatures which hurt me to the point where I had to cry. So it sounds very dramatic with my voice, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, but it is actually, it is very impressive from today to read that, her impressive study of the colonial realities, because immediately in that same letter also, she immediately connects it also to her analysis of colonialism, sort of as a multi-species project, because only a few lines afterwards, she writes in exactly the same way, step by step. She writes about the displacement of indigenous people in North America, relating that to the warblers. So in exactly the same way, this is again a quote, step by step, they have been pushed from their land by civilized men and abandoned to perish silently and cruelly. So, yes. And then in The Accumulation of Capital, but also in his Introduction to Political Economy, she writes extensively extensively about the plantation system. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but she writes a lot about how crises in Europe constantly then also fuel investment in the global south, in different territories, and writes about this land conversion and the immiseration of people and land, and the crisis fueled by the boom-bust bubbles, essentially, of kind of an emerging finance capitalism. So she writes about, for instance, how the American Civil War reduced European imports of US cotton, and that caused the cotton famine in Lancashire, and that then diverted colonial attention to the Indies and the Middle East, so that there sprung up plantations in Egypt as if by magic. And she also writes about the effects of these plantations. For instance, she writes about Brazil and sort of the other side of the capitalism that she was witnessing. So the other side, however, is the advancing immiseration of ever greater circles of humanity around the globe and the increasing uncertainty of their existence. After fertile and rich, Brazil had been transformed for the needs of European and North American capitalism into a gigantic wasteland of monotonous coffee plantations, and the indigenous people en masse into proletarianized wage slaves on these plantations. These wage slaves were suddenly exposed to a purely capitalist phenomenon, the so-called coffee crisis, resulting in long-term unemployment and naked hunger. So, So also in the introduction to the political economy, it's very interesting because she compares non-capitalist or mostly pre-capitalist societies to the advent of capitalism, and writes that previously, of course, without romanticizing the society, she writes how they actually were facing mostly natural cyclical crisis, perhaps floods or droughts. So she writes quite extensively how now the kind of crisis fueled by finance or financial booms and busts and the sudden investment comings and goings is of course also throwing these communities into further crisis. And I don't need to say much about her militant fight against colonialism because it has already been said. But I do think there's an interesting essay that she wrote about the eruption of Mount Pelée, the volcano on Martinique. Whatever the time. It's okay. So the Caribbean island and French colony of Martinique that erupted in 1902. And so it was a huge, devastating natural disaster in history, with the history that we lived in 1902. And so she was witnessing, and then she was picking up on this disaster. And it's a very, I recommend to read it, and it is also in the Rosy Luxemburg Reader, where she writes about this natural disaster in ways that really reminds me of the COVID pandemic, but also of climate disasters. She writes that, so after the volcano erupts, she writes that, and now in the ruins of the annihilated. And now, in the ruins of the annihilated city of Martinique, a new guest arrives, unknown, never seen before. The human being, not lords and bondsmen, not blacks and whites, not rich and poor, not plantation owners and wage slaves. Human beings have appeared on the tiny shattered island. Human beings who feel only the pain and see only the disaster, who only want to help and succor. Old Mont Pelée has worked a miracle. Forgotten are the days of Fashoda, forgotten the conflict over Cuba, forgotten La Revanche. And so this is amazing how she writes it, because this is, of course, that she writes this kind of ironically, because only a few sentences later she writes about how the colonial masters are all writing that they want to help and send money. And she, in her essay, denounced this hypocritical and ostentatious performance of concern by these metropolitan leaders in the aftermath of the disaster, which is reminiscent of today's response of or lackluster climate finance that I usually study also. But so she points out that these humanitarian the same masters that are offering humanitarian help, of course, and there she writes about the area, and writes about again, of course, colonist repression, where all of these humanitarian ideas of liberal capitalism, of course, don't exist. And in her critique of colonialism, and especially also in her comparison to non-capitalist communities, it is very It's very interesting, and I think it also kind of connects to the land question that came up earlier, where I think Rosy Luxemburg has very complex different ideas about it, but she does write a lot about non-capitalist societies and studies them. So, for instance, she studies extensively the German Marx societies, where she writes, "One cannot imagine anything any simpler and more harmonious than the economic system of the old Germanic Mark. Evidently, we have the entire mechanism of social life, a strict plan and a tight organization, incorporate everything each individual does and places him as a part into the whole. The immediate needs of everyday life and the equal fulfillment of everyone. This is the starting point and end point of the organization. Everyone works for everyone else and collectively decides on everything. Whence does this spring? On what does it base itself, this organization, this power and the collective over the individual? It is nothing other than the communism of land and soil, that is to say, the common possession of the most important means of production on the part of those who work." So, yeah. So, and in other writings, she also, I mean, we talked about it before, that, she also wrote about the self determination of the peoples, but maybe I come back to that. Oh, wait, I have. I've kind of. No, it's all right. So she's not actually romanticizing, however, though, these communities, even though she does say that they are actually in a way superior to capitalism in the way that they are organized, that they care for social reproduction in a way that capitalism doesn't, because capitalism is fundamentally anarchic and destructive. But then also, and you already explained this argument, that she didn't in any way supported liberal feminism or liberal environmentalism either. And she made that very clear also in the way that she described nature, and in the way that, for instance, in a letter that she wrote from prison to Hannah Elsbeth Stürmer, this is published in German in Die Geheimnisse eines Gefängnishofes. She wrote a letter from prison where she wrote about a lady, a wealthy fellow, that was a fellow inmate who complained about missing summer vacations. And there she writes in the letter, "It was clear. The lady lived with the firm conviction that nature began in the Tyrolean Alps with a spectacular sunset. If someone had told her that here, at Barnimstrasse number 10, where she stood and walked, she was surrounded by nature from morning to night, she would surely have thought they were making fun of her. Now, beautiful lady, I would like to invite you to take a little walk with me in this tiny realm of nature. And I don't want to make many quotes of her letters because they're very beautiful, and I don't just want to also recite letters, but I really recommend reading them because it really gives an understanding also of her really broad and complex thinking, which is also reflected in the fact that she studied the natural science, that she studied the sound of birds as seriously and as committedly as she studied zoology and as she studied the political economy or the theory of mass organization. And so this kind of listening, studying, and understanding the world in its different facets, and including also the impact that capitalism has on it, is a great contribution to a non-instrumentalist view of nature as well. And I cannot show the herbarium, but I also recommend, of course, reading that. And that, because I think we're getting to the end, then I will maybe just end with a letter then. Yes, I think that's a good one to end. This is from, I think it's to Louise Kautsky, but I forgot the year. I'm enjoying life so much. Every morning I thoroughly inspect the condition of the buds. This is from prison. Of the buds on all my bushes, and every day I visit a little red ladybug with 2 black spots on its back, which in spite of the wind and the cold, I have been keeping alive for a week on a little bow warmly surrounded by cotton wool, and I observe the clouds, how they are constantly being renewed and becoming ever more beautiful. And on the whole, I feel that I'm no more important than the ladybug, and I'm inexpressibly happy with the sense of my insignificance. And I think there will well end. But I could make more. Maybe we have time in the right time.